Jason's night shift as a security guard was usually uneventful. The office building he worked in was quiet after dark, with only the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional groan of the air conditioning to keep him company. His job was simple: monitor the security cameras, patrol the hallways every hour, and ensure the place stayed locked up. For months, nothing out of the ordinary had happened, until that night. It was a little past 3 a.m. when Jason felt the first prickling of unease. Sitting in the small security room, surrounded by screens showing every hallway and entrance, he rubbed his eyes, blaming his fatigue for the strange sense of discomfort. The night had been slow, and his coffee was barely keeping him awake. As he leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifted to one of the screens. There, in the West Wing hallway, a figure moved. Jason squinted and leaned forward, his heart skipping a beat. The image was grainy, but he could make out the shape of a woman. She was wearing a long white dress that brushed the floor as she walked. Her movements were slow, almost gliding, and her head was tilted slightly downward, obscuring her face. Jason's mind raced. No one was supposed to be in the building at this hour. The offices were locked, and only a few employees had access after hours. Reaching for his radio, Jason called his coworker, Greg, who was patrolling on the opposite side of the building. "Greg, you seeing this? There's someone in the West Wing hallway." "What? Are you sure?" Greg's voice crackled through the radio. "Yeah, go check it out." "I'll keep an eye on her from here," Jason said, his eyes glued to the screen. The woman continued down the hallway, her movements almost hypnotic. She turned a corner, disappearing from view. "On my way," Greg replied. Jason switched to the next camera feed, trying to catch sight of her again. Sure enough, she appeared, now further down the hall. Her dress shimmered faintly under the harsh fluorescent lights, and Jason noticed something odd. Her feet didn't make any sound. The building's floors were tiled, and footsteps always echoed, especially at night. But the hallway was eerily silent. Greg's voice crackled through the radio again. "I'm in the West Wing. I don't see anyone," Jason frowned. "She's right in front of you, heading towards the conference rooms. Check camera 8 if you don't believe me." "I'm looking right at it," Greg said, his tone uneasy. "The hallway's empty." Jason's stomach twisted. He flipped through the camera feeds, his heart pounding. The woman was still there, gliding down the hall, but Greg's flashlight beam passed right through where she should have been. Jason's breath caught in his throat. "Greg, get out of there," he said, his voice trembling. "Something's not right." "What are you talking about?" Greg asked, but the static in his voice hinted at his own rising fear. "You're freaking me out, man." Before Jason could respond, the figure stopped. She turned her head slowly towards the camera as if she could sense she was being watched. For the first time, Jason saw her face. His blood ran cold. Her eyes were dark voids, empty and endless. Her mouth hung open, stretched into a silent scream. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her features seemed slightly blurred, as if she didn't fully belong in this world. She stared directly into the camera, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity. And then, she disappeared. One moment she was there, and the next, the hallway was empty. Jason's hands shook as he gripped the edge of the desk. He flipped through the camera feeds, searching for her, but she was gone. The West Wing was completely still. "Jason?" Greg's voice came through the radio again, quieter this time. "What's going on? I'm heading back to the security room." Jason didn't answer. He was too focused on replaying the footage. He rewound the recording, his breath shallow. As he watched the woman appear and vanish again, a chill ran down his spine. There was no way to explain it. She hadn't walked off camera. She had simply blinked out of existence. When Greg returned, he found Jason pale and trembling. "What happened?" Greg asked, his voice laced with concern. Jason gestured to the screen. "Look for yourself." Greg leaned over and watched the footage, his face drained of color. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "I don't know," Jason said, his voice barely audible. "But she's not human." The two men sat in stunned silence for a moment before Jason spoke again. "I've heard stories about this place," he said. "People saying it's haunted, but I always thought it was just rumors." Greg swallowed hard. "What kind of stories?" Jason hesitated before answering. "A woman died here years ago. She was an accountant working late one night. They found her in the West Wing hallway. Heart attack, they said, but people claimed they'd see her roaming the halls after dark." Greg stared at the screen, his eyes wide. "You're telling me that was her?" Jason didn't respond. He didn't need to. The fear in his eyes said it all. For the rest of the night, neither of them could focus. Every creak of the building made them jump, and they kept glancing at the cameras, half expecting to see the woman again. But the West Wing remained empty. When their shift finally ended, Jason packed up his things and left without saying much. He avoided the West Wing on his final patrol and kept his eyes firmly on the ground, not daring to look into the shadows. The next day, he handed in his resignation. Greg lasted another week before he, too, quit. The office building eventually replaced its night security staff, but the whispers of what Jason and Greg had seen lingered. Employees refused to stay late, and rumors of the ghost in the white dress spread like wildfire. No one could prove she existed, but those who worked there at night always felt the same cold dread creeping up their spines. Years later, the building was demolished. But even as the walls came down, some workers claimed to see a figure in a white dress, standing in the rubble, watching silently as her home was destroyed. The night shift at the 911 dispatch center was usually quiet. For Mia, a seasoned operator, most calls during these hours were mundane. Noise complaints, minor accidents, or the occasional prank call. But this night felt different. There was a strange tension in the air, a silence that seemed too heavy. The hum of the computers and the soft beeping of the control panel were the only sounds breaking the stillness. It was close to 2 a.m. when the call came in. 911, "What's your emergency?" Mia said in her calm, professional tone. For a moment there was silence. Mia thought it might be another prank or a dropped call, but then she heard it. A faint whisper, so soft she almost missed it. "Help me," a woman's voice said, trembling. "He's here." Mia's posture straightened immediately, her heart rate quickening. "Ma'am, can you repeat that? Who's there? Are you in danger?" There was a pause, then the voice came again, barely audible. "Please help me. He's watching me." Mia quickly gestured to her colleague to begin tracing the call. "Ma'am, stay on the line with me. Can you tell me your location?" The woman didn't respond directly. Instead, Mia heard what sounded like a sob, muffled and full of fear. Then, a single word, "Hurry." The line went dead. Mia stared at her screen, her fingers frozen over the keyboard. "Did we get a location?" she asked, her voice urgent. Her colleague nodded. "It's an address on Maple Street. Sending it to the police now." Mia let out a breath of relief. "Thank you." She picked up the radio to relay the details to the nearest patrol unit. "We have a possible domestic disturbance at 1421 Maple Street. Caller sounded distressed and mentioned someone was watching her. Line disconnected. Please proceed with caution." Within minutes, 2 officers, Daniels and Harper, confirmed they were en route. Mia leaned back in her chair, her pulse still racing. She'd handled hundreds of calls in her career, but something about this one had unsettled her. The woman's voice, the raw fear, it felt too real. 15 minutes passed and the radio crackled to life. "Dispatch, this is Officer Daniels. We're at the address." Mia sat up straighter. "Copy that. What's the situation?" There was a long pause, too long. Mia felt a knot form in her stomach. "Dispatch, the house is abandoned," Daniels finally said. "It's boarded up. Looks like no one's lived here in years." Mia frowned. "Are you sure you have the right address? 1421 Maple Street?" "Affirmative," Daniels replied. "But there's no way anyone could have called from here. The place is completely sealed up. Windows are shattered and the doors nailed shut. No signs of recent activity." Mia's fingers tightened around her headset. "The call was traced to that address," she insisted. "Maybe the caller is nearby or hiding. Can you check the perimeter?" "Copy that," Daniels said. As the officers searched the area, Mia replayed the call in her mind. The fear in the woman's voice was unmistakable. She couldn't have imagined it. But if the house was abandoned, where had the call come from? The radio crackled again. "Dispatch, this is Harper. Perimeter's clear. No footprints, no signs of anyone around." Mia's unease deepened. "Understood. What about the phone line? Can you check if there's an active connection to the house?" Daniel's voice came through, slightly muffled. "Stand by." Mia waited, her eyes fixed on the monitor. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "Dispatch, there's no active phone line here. The wires were cut years ago. Mia's blood ran cold. "That's impossible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I spoke to her. The call came from that address." There was another long pause before Daniels replied, his tone cautious. "Are you sure about that, dispatch?" Mia didn't answer. She couldn't. Her hands were shaking now, her mind racing for an explanation. The line had been clear. The voice had been real. But if the house had no phone line, then where had the call come from? "Dispatch, we're heading back to the station," Daniels said. "There's nothing more we can do here." "Copy that," Mia replied, though her voice was hollow. She ended the transmission and sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. The trace data was still there, clear as day. The call had originated from 1421 Maple Street. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, just out of sight. She replayed the call over and over in her mind, the whispering voice haunting her thoughts. By the time her shift ended, she was exhausted, her nerves frayed. The following day, she couldn't resist doing some research. She looked up the address, digging through old news articles and records. What she found made her stomach churn. Years ago, a woman had lived at 1421 Maple Street. Her name was Evelyn Carter, and she had been murdered in her home by an intruder. The details were grisly, stab wounds, signs of a struggle. But the most chilling part was the timeline. Evelyn had called 911 during the attack, begging for help, but the police had arrived too late. By the time they entered the house, she was already dead. Mia stared at the screen, her hands trembling. The date of Evelyn's murder was exactly 10 years to the day, and the last words in the case report echoed the ones she'd heard on the call. "Help me, he's here." The room seemed to grow colder as Mia sat there, the realization sinking in. The call she had received wasn't a prank or a mistake. It was a cry for help, from beyond the grave. For weeks after, Mia struggled to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Evelyn's voice, faint and desperate. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew the truth. Evelyn had reached out to her, reliving her final moments, trapped in the echoes of that horrific night. And Mia could only wonder how many other calls like this had gone unanswered. How many other voices were lost in the static, waiting for someone to hear them. Late nights at the old St. Augustine Hospital were always unnervingly quiet. The graveyard shift seemed to stretch endlessly, the minutes creeping by as the sterile halls echoed with the occasional beep of monitors and the distant hiss of ventilators. For Emma, a young nurse who had recently joined the staff, the nights felt heavier than they should. The hospital's age didn't help. It was over 80 years old, with its creaky floors and dim, flickering lights. There were whispers among the staff about the place being haunted, but Emma had laughed them off. She didn't believe in ghosts. That was until one night during one of her routine rounds. It was close to 3:30 a.m. when Emma started her walk through the East Wing. Most of the patients in this wing were stable, so the floor was quiet, the kind of silence that made her feel like she was the only person alive in the world. She adjusted her stethoscope around her neck, her footsteps echoing softly in the corridor. As she approached the end of the hall, she noticed something unusual. A figure, an elderly man, stood near the window at the far end of the corridor. He was wearing a hospital gown, his back turned to her as he gazed out into the night. Emma frowned. None of her patients should be out of their rooms at this hour, especially not alone. "Sir?" she called out gently, not wanting to startle him. The man didn't respond. His frail frame seemed almost too still, like a statue. Emma quickened her pace, concern growing in her chest. "Sir, you're not supposed to be out here. Let me help you back to your room." As she neared him, the man began to move, slowly shuffling down the hall. His movements were stiff and deliberate, and his hospital gown rustled faintly with each step. Emma followed, her heart pounding slightly faster. "Sir, please stop. You might hurt yourself." The man turned a corner at the end of the hall, disappearing from view. Emma hurried after him, determined to catch up before he wandered too far. But when she rounded the corner, the hallway was empty. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The corridor stretched out before her, lined with closed doors and dim lighting. There was no sign of the man, no sound of footsteps, nothing. Emma's pulse quickened. She knew he couldn't have gone far. There were no exits on this side of the wing, and the only doors led to patient rooms or storage closets. She checked the nearest door, finding it locked. The next door opened to an empty supply room. Her chest tightened with confusion. Where could he have gone? Deciding to report the incident, Emma returned to the nurse's station. Her steps hurried. Two of her co-workers, Linda and Mark, were seated at the desk, sipping coffee and chatting quietly. "Hey," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. "Did either of you see an older man wandering the halls just now? I tried to stop him, but he disappeared." Linda raised an eyebrow. "An older man? What did he look like?" Emma hesitated, replaying the brief glimpse she'd had of him. He was tall, thin, wearing a hospital gown. He had gray hair and looked tired. "I thought he was a patient, but he's gone now." Linda and Mark exchanged a look, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something darker. "What is it? What is it?" Emma asked, her unease growing. Mark leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Are you sure about what you saw? Because there haven't been any male patients on this floor for weeks." Emma stared at him, confused. "That can't be right. I saw him with my own eyes." Linda exhaled slowly, her gaze serious. "Did he look like this?" she asked, pulling a photo from her desk drawer. It was an old, black and white picture of a man in his 60s, smiling faintly at the camera. He was wearing what looked like an early version of a hospital gown. Emma's stomach dropped. It was him, the man she'd just seen wandering the halls. "Where did you get this?" Emma demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda hesitated before answering. "That's Mr. Hargrove. He was a patient here, a long time ago. He died in this hospital." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean he died here? When?" "Back in the 70s, Mark said. He was admitted for heart failure, spent weeks in this hospital right here in the East Wing. One night, he got out of bed and collapsed in the hallway. By the time anyone found him, it was too late. He died right where you said you saw him." Emma's mouth went dry. "You're saying I saw his ghost?" Linda shrugged, though her expression was tense. "You wouldn't be the first. A few of the night staff have reported seeing him over the years. He always shows up in the East Wing, walking the halls like he's still looking for something. Some people think he doesn't know he's dead." Emma shook her head, trying to make sense of it. "But he was so real. He looked like any other patient." "That's how it usually is," Mark said grimly. "But he never stays for long. Just vanishes before anyone can get close." For the rest of her shift, Emma couldn't shake the image of Mr. Hargrove from her mind. Every time she passed the East Wing, she felt like she was being watched, though she never saw him again that night. The stories her co-workers had told her played on a loop in her head, and for the first time in her career, she felt afraid to walk the halls alone. When the morning finally came and her shift ended, Emma left the hospital feeling drained and uneasy. She told herself it had to be a trick of the mind, a figment of her imagination brought on by exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the old hospital. But deep down, she knew what she had seen. In the weeks that followed, Emma heard more stories from other staff members, stories of shadowy figures, unexplained noises, and objects moving on their own. But none of them stuck with her as much as Mr. Hargrove's silent, lonely presence in the hallway. She began to understand why the older nurses always whispered about the hospital's ghosts. St. Augustine wasn't just a place for the living. It was a place where the past lingered, where memories and spirits refused to let go. And every time Emma walked the East Wing, she couldn't help but glance at the corner where she had last seen him, half expecting to see his thin figure standing there, watching her with eyes that had seen decades come and go. The gas station stranger nights at the gas station were usually quiet, almost boring. For Ryan, working the late shift was a way to save up some cash while finishing college, but he didn't mind the solitude. The gas station was on a remote stretch of highway, surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. Most nights, the only company he had were the occasional truck drivers passing through and the constant hum of fluorescent lights above the counter. It was nearing 2 a.m. on a particularly still night. Ryan leaned back in his chair, sipping lukewarm coffee as he stared at the small TV mounted in the corner of the station. The gas pumps outside were empty, their lights casting a pale glow on the cracked pavement. Inside, the store was spotless, every shelf stocked and aligned. Everything felt normal, almost too normal. That's when the bell above the door jingled and a man stepped inside. Ryan straightened in his chair, his eyes immediately drawn to the stranger. The man looked disheveled, his clothes wrinkled and damp with sweat. He had a scruffy beard and dark circles under his eyes, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow him. His movements were jittery, his breathing shallow and uneven. "Hey," Ryan greeted, trying to sound casual, though something about the man put him on edge. "Need help with something?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the windows before focusing on Ryan. "Yeah," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "I need directions. Do you know how to get to Maplewood?" Ryan frowned. Maplewood was a small town about 20 miles away, but the route to get there was straightforward. Most people who stopped at the station knew the area well enough not to ask for directions. "Sure," Ryan said, standing up. "You just head down the highway, take the second exit, and follow the signs. Can't miss it." The man nodded, but didn't seem to be listening. He kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes flicking back to the windows. "Thanks," he muttered, turning toward the door. Ryan watched him leave, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. As the man stepped outside, Ryan noticed a black van parked in the far corner of the lot, its engine idling softly. The van's windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. It hadn't been there earlier, and Ryan hadn't heard it pull in. The man glanced at the van as he walked toward his car, a beat-up sedan parked near the pumps. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, then hurriedly got inside and started the engine. Ryan moved closer to the window, watching as the sedan pulled out of the lot. The black van didn't move. Something about the van felt off. It wasn't unusual for people to park in the lot for a few minutes, especially truckers taking a break, but this was different. The van's engine kept running, and its headlights stayed off. Ryan's unease grew. He walked over to the door and locked it, a habit he rarely needed on these quiet nights. The sound of the lock clicking into place gave him a small sense of relief, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Minutes passed, and the van didn't move. Ryan tried to focus on his work, but his eyes kept drifting to the vehicle outside. He thought about calling the police, but what would he say? A van was parked outside, and he didn't like the way it looked. It didn't seem like enough to justify a call. Suddenly, the bell above the door jingled again. Ryan froze. He was sure he had locked it. He turned to see the same man standing outside, banging on the glass with both fists. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Let me in!" he screamed, his voice frantic. "Please, they're coming! You have to let me in!" Ryan's heart raced. He took a step back, unsure of what to do. The man looked desperate, his hands slamming against the glass with increasing urgency. "They're going to kill me!" the man shouted, his voice cracking. "Please." Ryan's gaze darted to the van. Its engine roared to life, and the headlights flicked on, casting long, eerie shadows across the lot. The van pulled forward slowly, creeping toward the gas station like a predator stalking its prey. The man outside turned to look at the van and screamed, a guttural, terrified sound that made Ryan's blood run cold. "No!" the man shouted, backing away from the door. "No! No! No!" Before Ryan could react, the man took off running, disappearing into the darkness beyond the lot. The van sped up, its tires screeching as it peeled out of the lot and vanished down the highway. The silence that followed was deafening. Ryan stood frozen, his mind racing. What had just happened? Who was in the van? And why was the man so afraid? He unlocked the door and stepped outside, his eyes scanning the lot. There was no sign of the man or the van. The only sound was the distant chirping of crickets and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Shaking, Ryan went back inside and locked the door again. He spent the rest of his shift in a state of heightened anxiety, jumping at every sound and checking the windows constantly. But the man in the van never returned. When his shift ended at dawn, Ryan left the gas station and drove straight home, his mind replaying the events of the night over and over. He never saw the man or the van again, but the memory of that night haunted him for years. To this day, Ryan wonders who or what was in that van, and he can't shake the image of the man's terrified face as he banged on the glass, screaming for help. The old factory loomed in the darkness, its rusted steel frame groaning as the wind howled through the cracks in its walls. Mike had been working maintenance at the factory for over a decade, and though he was used to its eerie atmosphere, something about the night shift always made him uneasy. The factory had been partially shut down for years, with only a skeleton crew left to maintain the machinery. Most of the massive building was empty, the production lines silent and abandoned. Mike's shift began like any other. Armed with his tool belt and flashlight, he moved through the factory floor, inspecting the ancient machines that still clung to life. The hum of the few working conveyor belts was the only sound, accompanied by the occasional hiss of steam escaping from a rusty pipe. The air was thick with the smell of oil and metal, a scent Mike had long grown accustomed to. It was around 2 a.m. when the silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed through the cavernous building, cutting through the distant hum of machinery. Mike paused, his wrench halfway to a bolt, and turned his head toward the source of the noise. "Hey, who's there?" he called out, his voice bouncing off the walls. He waited, but no one responded. Thinking it might be one of his co-workers, Mike shrugged it off and went back to his task. The footsteps, however, didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, as if someone or something was approaching him. Mike set down his wrench and grabbed his flashlight, shining its beam into the darkened expanse of the factory floor. "Guys, if this is a prank, it's not funny," he said, his voice tinged with irritation. Still, there was no reply. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was almost oppressive. Mike felt a chill run down his spine, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Swallowing his unease, he climbed down from the machine he was working on and began to walk toward the source of the noise. As he moved across the floor, the beam of his flashlight caught something on the ground. Wet footprints. They were large, barefoot, and glistening in the dim light. The factory had no running water on this side of the building, and Mike couldn't understand where the moisture had come from. He crouched down, touching one of the prints with his hand. It was icy cold. Mike straightened, his heart pounding in his chest. The footprints led away from him, weaving through the machinery and toward a storage room at the far end of the floor. Against his better judgment, he decided to follow them. The air grew colder as he approached the storage room, each step heavier than the last. The door to the room was ajar, its rusty hinges creaking as the wind pushed it back and forth. Mike hesitated, gripping the flashlight tightly in one hand and a wrench in the other. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was pitch black, the weak beam of his flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. Rows of shelves lined the walls, stacked with dusty tools and forgotten equipment. The footprints ended in the middle of the room, but there was no one there. No sign of a person, no sign of movement, just silence. And then he felt it, a sudden drop in temperature, so cold that his breath came out in visible puffs. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. He wasn't alone. Mike spun around, shining his flashlight in every direction. The room was empty, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. He could feel eyes on him, cold and unrelenting. The light flickered, and for a split second, he thought he saw a shadow move at the edge of the beam. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Show yourself." The light flickered again, and this time he heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it was almost inaudible. It sounded like his name. "Mike." He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The whisper came again, louder this time, echoing off the walls. The air grew even colder, and the flashlight began to dim. Panic set in, and Mike backed toward the door, his eyes darting around the room. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging the room into complete darkness. Mike dropped the wrench as he threw himself against the door, pulling at the handle with all his strength. It wouldn't budge. He was trapped. The whispering grew louder, surrounding him, filling his ears. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, overlapping and indecipherable like a chorus of the dead. Mike screamed, pounding on the door, but the voices only grew louder, more frantic. He could feel the cold closing in around him, pressing against his skin, seeping into his bones. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The door swung open, nearly throwing Mike off balance. He stumbled out of the storage room, his flashlight flickering back to life. The factory was silent again, the air warmer, almost normal, but the footprints were gone, as if they had never been there. Shaking, Mike ran back to the maintenance office and locked the door behind him. He spent the rest of his shift huddled in a corner, clutching his flashlight and refusing to venture out onto the factory floor again. When the morning crew arrived, he quit on the spot, refusing to ever step foot in the factory again. Years later, Mike learned that the factory had a dark history. Decades earlier, a worker had died in a terrible accident on the floor near the storage room. Some said his spirit never left, wandering the factory at night, searching for something or someone. Mike never went back to find out.